Hi, I'm Josh, and I am so very grateful that you have chosen to spend some of your valuable leisure time with me as I talk about the board games I played in the month of May. I didn't purchase any games that month, but it was a good month for games played. I played a whole bunch of games that were new to me and some old favorites, so let's get straight into it. My first gaming session in May was a two-player session with my primary board gaming friend, and we played an old favorite to start off the month, and that was Clank. This time we played with the Sunken Treasures expansion. A couple months ago we played Clank with the newest expansion, Temple of the Ape Lords, whereas Sunken Treasures is the first expansion that had come out for Clank. It adds interesting water elements where you can take a shortcut down into the dungeon by dropping into the water, but in doing so you make noise and thus generate more clank. Also, the underwater passages, if you stay in them for more than one turn, cause your health to decrease. And so you don't want to stay in these underwater passages unless you get a new market item, which is the scuba gear that allows you to both travel more quickly through these underwater passages and remain underwater without losing health. So it's a very interesting twist on the base game of Clank. It doesn't add anything too over the top extraordinary, but it does add some fun elements that weren't present in the original base game. So as such, I think it is a highly successful expansion. I rate Clank as a whole, along with all of its expansions, a 9 out of 10, and the friend that I played with ranks at 9.5 out of 10. So a really excellent deck building, push your luck game is Clank. Next up, we got back to a game we had played last month, and that is Traders of Osaka. Again, this is a very simple and quick playing card-based game where cards have multiple uses, where you're purchasing goods and then using goods to score points as ships reach their destinations. I talked about it in a little bit more detail in my Games Played in April video if you want to check it out. I rate this game 7 out of 10, although I was tempted to push it up to about a 7.5 after playing it again. It is just such a fun little game, but I've decided for now to keep it at 7. The friend that I play with does rate this game 7.5 out of 10. Now next is a game that I had purchased in April, and that is New York Zoo, a game by Uwe Rosenberg, and once again, this is a polyomino tile-laying game by Uwe Rosenberg, one of his favorite mechanisms to play around with. And as such, I would say it's very much a cross between Patchwork and Baron Park. If you're at all familiar with those two games, New York Zoo is going to be very familiar to you. So it's a very straightforward game of collecting these various polyomino shaped tiles and trying to fill up your board more quickly than your opponent. In doing so, you also get to collect different animals and put them in your little funny shaped buildings there, and that helps you to fill in your space a little bit quicker. So there is that kind of extra little element that wasn't present in Patchwork, but otherwise it is a very similar game, even to the point where you're kind of going around a circle of tiles and picking a tile or picking some animals as you go around and adding them to your play area. So this ended up being very fun. I played initially with my children as a 3-player game, so my 10 and 12-year-olds were able to pick up on the game and play it with me, and I rated the game 7 out of 10, which is the same rating that I give to Patchwork, but if I had to rank them, I would put New York Zoo just slightly above Patchwork, because even though it doesn't have the buttons economy that Patchwork has, it does have some more interesting stuff going on with the animals that come into play. Plus, I mean, it has these really amazing wooden animal pieces that I just adore as well, so it gets extra marks for that. But New York Zoo ended up being a hit, really enjoyable game. Next up was another game that I had purchased in April, and that is Maglev Metro. So when I was talking about it in the April video, I talked about how this is kind of a cross between a standard train game where you're building track and then picking up passengers and delivering them along your train lines to various cities, and you're combining that with kind of an engine building type game where the passengers that you pick up go on your player board, and each passenger you place on your player board helps to increase the abilities that you have in terms of building your tracks, moving your train around. All the stuff you're doing in the game, all the actions you take can become enhanced enhanced and improved over time by collecting the passengers and placing them onto your board. In addition to that, the passengers that you collect can also be placed in spaces where they give you more victory points at the end of the game. This game has a few weird fiddly rules, but once you get into it, it's pretty quick playing. The actions that you do on a turn don't take very long at all, and it zips along at a good pace once players are familiar with it. I should mention that this was with my second play session with my gaming friend, again a two-player gaming session, and I found Maglev Metro to be fun. It was not quite as amazing as I kind of expected it to be from when I was looking over the game prior to picking it up. I did wonder if the way that you place the passengers to improve your game engine, how much that really varies from game to game, because it seemed that I really kind of wanted to go a certain direction with them. In particular, I really went hard on activating my victory point cards, and that ended up allowing me to win a huge victory in the first game we played. So I do wonder about the differences from game to game, but it was very enjoyable. I rated the game a 7.5 out of 10, and the friend that I played with rated it 8 out of 10. So it was a pretty big hit all in all. And then the second game we played for that session was a cooperative trick-taking game called The Fox in the Forest Duet. This is just a little game that I picked up from my friend because he enjoys those kind of classic trick-taking card games. And I heard a lot of good things about this one, in particular the fact that they had turned this into a two-player cooperative game, which, for one thing, a two-player trick-taking game seemed like kind of a wild idea, but a cooperative trick-taking game seemed like an even crazier idea. So when you add those two things together with the trick-taking aspect, I was quite interested to see how it would work out, and it was very interesting. I definitely felt myself wanting to try it again once we kind of got through the game and got to figure out how things generally worked. I enjoyed it. I rated the game 7 out of 10. My friend ended up rating it 7.5 out of 10. So for anyone who's looking for just a really tiny, portable, two-player cooperative game, this is definitely one to check out. Before I go on, I want to take a real quick second here to send out a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters, in particular to my higher tier supporters, Joanna, Paul, and Asmanda's Perfect. I never forget your support. I never want you to forget how much I appreciate that support, and so I just want to send out that thank you and a reminder of how much you are appreciated. Now back to the games. The next gaming session was a two-player session with my 12-year-old son, and we pulled out an old favorite of his called Downforce, which is this car racing game in which we have typically played the family rules, in which it is very much a straightforward card-based race where you're trying to get your cars across the finish line first. The experienced gamer rules of the game add a really interesting wagering system where you're putting money on the results of the race, and ultimately you want to have the most money at the end of the game rather than be the first car across the finish line necessarily. But when playing with my sons, I typically play the race game version. We played with the newest expansion called Wild Ride. The first game we played on the animals side of the board, where there are these animals walking across the track as the game progresses that might impede the progress of the cars on the track at various points. And then after that game, we flipped over to the other side of the map on the same Wild Ride expansion, and we played with the jumps. And this time, my 10-year-old came into the game, and we played a 3-player game. And the jumps also add a really interesting aspect in which if you play a fast enough card, you can get over the jumps and jump pretty far ahead. But if you don't have a fast enough card, you kind of have to drive around them and take kind of the slower route. So the Wild Ride expansion is an interesting expansion for the base game of Downforce. I rate the game a 7 out of 10. My 12-year-old son, who I primarily play it with, rates the game 8 out of 10. So it's definitely a very fun family experience. Next up, with my 12-year-old, I played a game called Brains, Family, Bergen, and Draken, which is a real-time puzzling game where players at the same time are racing to create pathways to reach castles and dragons on the board. So it's a kind of a path-building game that's done in real time. And the first player to finish moves on to the second round, which is even harder, whereas players who have not finished first remain on the easier rounds until they can basically win the round and catch up to the next level. And so there's an interesting little catch-up mechanism where throughout the course of 3 rounds of play, the maps get exponentially more difficult, and so it is easier for players to kind of keep up as other players are struggling on higher levels to finish before the easier levels are done for the other players. So because of that, it is easy for my kids to keep up with me, or at least my 12-year-old in particular, who is pretty good at puzzling out these routes. And really, on level 3, the highest level you reach here, the path puzzles are really difficult. It can take several minutes even for me to create a pathway. And so because of that, my 12-year-old does periodically beat me at this game, because that 3rd level is really quite a challenge to finish successfully. So it's an interesting real-time puzzly type game that I rate 6.5 out of 10 just as a fun little family game, and my 12-year-old boy rates 8 out of 10. It's one that he every so often will request for me to pull out. Next, with my 12-year-old, we played some Star Realms. I've talked about this in previous months, so I won't get into that. It's a very basic deck building game where you start with your 10 basic cards, gradually purchase more powerful cards, and try to get your opponent down to 0 life points before you get knocked down to 0. So very basic 2-player deck building game that's a lot of fun. I rate the game 6.5 out of 10 just as kind of a fun basic deck builder. My 12-year-old, though, really loves it. He rates it 10 out of 10 and requests it fairly often these days. The final game I played with my son is the other game that I had purchased in April, and that is the game Trains, along with its Rising Sun standalone expansion. So speaking of deck building, this is very much a Dominion-influenced deck building game where they've taken Dominion, sort of the granddaddy of deck building games, and they've turned it into a train game where they've added this map where you're creating train routes and connecting cities together and trying to end up with the most points. So it has the simplicity of a game like Dominion, where the game is very easy to learn and play, but it has that interesting aspect of the board play with the train stuff that's going on here. I played this 2-player twice. First I played with my son, and then for my last session I'm about to talk about, I did break it out with my gaming friend, my adult friend, and managed to get a couple of games of Trains in the month of May. It's an old game that, while it is relatively basic, the Rising Sun expansion in particular adds a lot of interesting cards that you can mix into the game. So the base game itself might not be quite as interesting, but the Rising Sun stuff adds quite a huge variety of combos that you can end up playing with. So ultimately I rated Trains with the Rising Sun expansion a 7 out of 10. My adult gaming friend who I played with it in the next session also rates the game 7 out of 10. It's nothing too spectacular, but it's just a very basic, fun, really can't go wrong type of game experience that is quite enjoyable. So getting to the final session of the month was once again a 2-player session with my gaming friend. We broke out New York Zoo, and after trying it 3-player with my 2 young kids earlier in the month, I tried it 2-player with him and found it held up very well as a 2-player game. Still enjoyed the experience. Like I said, I rated it 7 out of 10. My friend rated it 7.5 out of 10, so he also enjoyed it. Then, as I mentioned, we got to Trains with Rising Sun, and then finally we got back once again to Traders of Osaka, just because we're finding it is such a perfect little filler style game where we have a bit of time left at the end of the gaming session. Well, let's break out a game of Traders of Osaka. We can get it set up in no time at all, get through a game in about 30 minutes, and it just creates such a fun little experience. There's nothing too terribly amazing going on with this game, but what it just does really well, and it is super fun. Again, 7 out of 10 for me, 7.5 out of 10 for my friend. And that wraps up the games played in May. Now it's your turn to tell me what games you have been getting to the table. What games have you been purchasing recently? As you know, I am always interested in hearing what is going on in your board gaming life, or even your video gaming life if you're more into that type of thing. Do let me know in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching. Hey, it's Josh. You know why I'm here. Sometimes you just need that friendly reminder to give a little thumb up, to subscribe to the channel, to share the video with somebody who would enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers. You have chosen to spend some of your valuable leisure leisure time. Your valuable leisure. I did get a lot of games played, including newest expansion, Temple of the Eight. I talked about it a little bit in more. I talked about it in a little bit more detail last month, so you can check that video. And that helps you to complete your basically where when I was and I thought progress of the cars on the track I really can't lose, really can't go wrong type of game. Really can't go